Hey, Pippa, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to finally be here.
Absolutely. I am really excited that we're sitting down to have this conversation. You and I were sort of talking before recording. We've talked a little bit before back and forth in Instagram, which is really how I even got to know about what you're doing in the world. And we talk a lot on this podcast about social media, the pros, the cons, and just this soup that we're in living at this time in history. And I'm really grateful for Instagram in this case for kind of leading me to you all and what you're doing. So, I think we'll probably touch on some of the reasons that social media plays maybe a not such a great role in some of the things that you're trying to do in the world. But nevertheless, I'm glad that you're here and that we did get connected. I would love for you to share with the listeners your story. Why, what were some of the things that you went through in your own personal experience that led you to go on this mission with the Red S Project?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll start from the very beginning,
Yeah.
and just lead on to why I'm so passionate about this cause. But I guess I started sport in the way that we all do, just for the pure love of it, just enjoying being out with friends, and my family were super sporty, so they always dragged me along. I was the youngest of four children, and my parents also played golf and squash and hockey, and so we just loved sport. It was in our family dynamic from the very beginning. And I ran for my school and eventually won the English school's track competition, which was like a massive deal to me at the time. It was something that really ignited this spark that I loved the process of getting good at something, and I wanted more of it. So I went off to university in England and I focused entirely on running as opposed to other sports that I had maintained an interest in until that point. And I progressed really nicely over there. I was at the University of Birmingham, which is renowned for its running and awesome athletics environment. And I had a brilliant coach called Bud Baldaro, who's a bit of a famous name here in the UK and probably in other countries too. But we had an awesome team atmosphere. It was super supportive. Everybody was pretty balanced. We partied as much as we trained, and we rested and ate. And it was honestly a very supportive and balanced environment. But it got to 2 years into that university setup, and I just felt like I was at the right point to make a change, and to take my athletics to the next level. And at that time, I was being offered scholarships from other universities in America. And I had been offered scholarships for a number of years, but I just never really felt like it was the right time. And I was so set on going to Birmingham that that wasn't going to change or sway my decision. But after 2 years there, I felt like, yeah, it was time. So off I went to Florida State University, which was at the time one of the best distance running schools in the States. And I was part of this incredible program. It was this very female focused environment where we all trained as a team. We didn't really interact much with the guys. We didn't really socialize much outside of our running unit. And it was incredibly professional compared to what I was used to in the UK. And that is a huge difference between universities in the UK and the States, is just the level of professionalism and the high performance environment. And so there, I guess I'd made quite a sacrifice to jump ship and go abroad and put my British degree on hold in order to do that. And I'd left a boyfriend behind, I'd left loads of friends and my coach, and I really was stepping into the unknown. And at first, I thrived. I thought, wow, this is really it. I've made it. I'm training and living and eating and breathing the sport that I care so much about. And after a while, I started to get better. I was, dragged up, I suppose, by these other girls that I was being pushed by, which was a bit novel because I guess in the UK, we're a bit more spread out. The standards are perhaps a little different, and you have to almost train with the guys at your local club if you want to have some decent competition. So it was really different to be brought along by these girls on their journey too. But unfortunately for me, it was also potentially a little bit too professional, in that everybody was starting to talk about this concept of clean eating, which was so popular back then in 2012, 2013. And it was an approach that was adopted by my coach and the team. And we had these training logs, and in that we were supposed to record, what we were going to cut back on in the lead up to the race season, and how we could maximize our potential for that season of competition. And I guess just that focus on food being the first time I'd ever really considered my diet as an athlete, at least to the extent that I did, and more training, more intensity and volume of training was just this perfect storm. I know you've spoken about it lots on your previous podcast, but just overtraining and underfueling is just the perfect storm for a condition like relative energy deficiency in sport, RED-S. And I didn't know at the time that this condition existed, and it was only introduced in 2014, which was around the time I was starting to suffer from this initial signs and symptoms. But of course, when research is published, it takes a while for that to trickle down into the mass awareness. So I struggled on with this seemingly disconnected myriad of symptoms, low energy, a growing preoccupation with my food and my body, these little niggles, injuries and illnesses that kept coming back and took a while to go away. And eventually just this persistent tiredness that would consume my day-to-day activities as well as my running. And I started to suffer from poor performances, and I think that was what really made me sit up and listen, something's wrong here. And sadly, at the time, that was all I cared about. I was there to train and to race, and I was so focused on that I didn't really notice the other issues that were occurring. So to cut a bit of a long story short, I eventually finished my degree in Florida, and I returned home in this pretty poor state of mental and physical health. And I set about looking for answers as to what on earth could be wrong. I'd had blood tests and nothing had really flagged as abnormal except low iron, which isn't particularly uncommon in endurance athletes, especially. But I knew that there was more to it. I just had this feeling this isn't just low iron. And actually, I thought it was something much more sinister, something wrong with my thyroid, or, I didn't know what, but I wanted to explore it. So I went from doctor to doctor. Nobody knew. No one once suggested the female athlete triad, which was the precursor to RED-S. Nobody looked into my bone density or asked me about my periods. And when I mentioned that I'd come off the pill and they hadn't returned, no one said, "Oh, that's a bit of an issue. Let's dive into that." So it took a long, long time to get a diagnosis. And the reason I was able to was because I had done so much internet research that eventually I'd stumbled across a blog from another athlete who was experiencing something similar, and they had mentioned this term. And then I Googled RED-S specialist and managed to find Dr. Nikki Kay in London. Went to see her, and pretty quickly we had the answer. So that was my journey to this condition that impacted the majority of my 20s. And as a result of the long-winded diagnosis and then recovery process, I became really passionate about helping other people avoid these symptoms and this condition to begin with, because life's too short to lose so much time to A, finding out what's wrong, and B, then trying to recover from things. And that's what led me to create Project RED-S, which came about during lockdown when I was on furlough from my day job. And here we are now, a couple of years down the line, and working hard to improve awareness, prevention, and support for relative energy deficiency.
What an incredible story. And I'm sure there are going to be many people listening to this who hear shades of themselves in their own experiences or some parallels to what you went through. And most of the people who listen to this podcast are not in college anymore. They're, in their 40s or 50s, but yet I have a feeling that so many will recognize either their earlier athletic history or even the present, because we have so many people who are now grown through their 20s and their 30s and are now 40s, 50s, et cetera, who are still potentially dealing with some of these things. And so that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring you on, is to just give this perspective of, hey, like, here are some of the things that I went through, your own personal story. And of course, that being such a powerful um, genesis of this new project that you started to make a positive impact. Going back to something that you said earlier on, you were talking about your university in Birmingham and how you guys had kind of a nice balance between partying and training. And, you said you would eat and train and party and those sorts of things. Was fueling adequately for track or whatever running you were doing, was that ever part of the conversation? Because I heard, when you went to Florida and your coach then adopted this idea of clean eating, that's one thing. But was there ever any sort of positive talk of the importance of fueling for athletes when you were back in the UK in school?
I'm sure there was, but it was a time in my life when I wasn't even conscious of the fact you could refine your diet, supposedly in order to maximize your performance in sport. If anything, I needed to be told to eat a few more vegetables and cut out on so many sugary snacks because my teeth were going to rot or something. So, if there was, I wasn't in need of any particular guidance at that time, because I feel like when so many of us are growing up, we have a relatively balanced diet. When we're brought up by, at least my generation, we ate 3 meals a day plus snacks, and that comprised carbohydrates, proteins, vegetables, fats. No one really overthought it in the younger years. And actually, it was the rise of social media and all this focus on the athletic aesthetic, for me, that became this problem when I moved away from home. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question very well, but it wasn't a focus back then.
Yeah. Yeah, and I hear that a lot, and that was my own experience. Even though I wasn't formally in collegiate athletics, I kind of skipped over that phase. I did stuff in high school, and then after I was out of college, picked up mountain biking. But there was never any discussion, even when I was in high school, of, hey, this is why fueling yourself, this is why eating enough to match your activity level is so important. Not even the sports performance, like how can we maximize and get those extra few percentage points potentially, or extra few percentages out of our performance. There was just no discussion about it at all. It was like a vacuum.
Yeah.
And so much like you were talking about social media for you, I graduated in high school in 1997. So coming up through the mid 90s, the education, and I'm using heavy air quotes here, that we had about food was things that we learned about the food pyramid when we were little kids, or things that we read in magazines, because
Mm.
the internet was just starting to become a thing. I remember getting on the internet at my friend's house when I was 14. So we didn't have, even the social media wasn't really a thing back then. So we saw it in magazines and commercials, advertisements for things like Slim Fast. And so then the 90s aesthetic of extremely thin supermodels and those sorts of things. So I feel like that was our education. And
Mm.
we didn't have that really strong voice of, hey, we gotta eat enough. This is really, really important.
Yeah, totally. And I remember, topics like sports nutrition and sports psychology seemed
Mhm.
almost to be reserved for the elite sports people. And now we see recreational sports people taking those kinds of things really seriously, for better or worse.
Mhm.
But yeah, then, it was just eat when you're hungry, and, eating disorders are for people who are vain or supermodels. And I never for a second considered the fact that they were rife within sports settings too. And I don't really think that was part of the conversation then.
Mhm. When you mentioned 2014, the first sort of IOC consensus paper on Red S being published, and that was sort of the first time there was this introduction of this term, and it was really new. And we think back to, I think it was 92, where female athlete triad came into the literature. So we had this sort of gap of time. And you were mentioning all of the things that you were personally experiencing, right? All the effects of low energy availability and lower energy intake. Do you feel like, because, or what your experiences and potential symptoms were didn't exactly just kind of line up and match up with female athlete triad, that things got missed over for you? Or do you
Yeah,
think if there was a
totally.
broader totality of here are all the effects, it would have turned out differently?
Completely. Yeah, I actually count myself pretty lucky to have been struggling with this in the time that this condition was being talked about a little bit more, because I didn't tick any of the boxes for the female athlete triad, or at least I didn't know I did, because I was using the pill, I wasn't having my bone density assessed, and I would never have identified with disordered eating, and I didn't know what low energy availability was. It wasn't really something I ever considered. So yes, if I had been presented with a broader spectrum of symptoms and been a bit more aware that this can impact anybody besides female athletes, I might have been more keen to engage with the idea that this was what was the problem.
Yeah, for sure. And I hear that a lot where even kind of going into the perimenopausal years, people can sometimes have a lot of fluctuation with their menstrual cycle. Things can get really irregular. And oftentimes people will think, okay, well, what I'm experiencing is down to this perimenopausal shift. But concurrently, sometimes they've got red S or at least chronic low energy availability going on. And so some of the things they're experiencing are more down to the lack of appropriate energy intake. Have you seen anything kind of out in the world, like in your discussions with your advisory board and the people you're talking to, the scientists, like, have you run across anything in that realm where we're sort of also thinking about now older athletes and how this might be affecting people?
Yeah, I think there is a distinct lack of research in that realm, and I'm looking forward to. I know that people are doing some amazing work as we speak, so I'm looking forward to seeing more and more come out. But no, I get lots of emails from people through the project to say, look, I'm an older athlete, so I don't know if I'm experiencing red S, but could you direct me towards someone who might know? And it's very tricky to ascertain whether that is the cause of their symptoms, or if it's the perimenopause, or if it's a combination of the two. But I suppose the advice medically and lifestyle wise is fairly similar. Eat the right amount of the right foods and lift some weights and try to think more holistically about your health and well-being. So I'm looking forward to more research to help us really establish what's going on. But for now, I think we're still a little far behind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would agree with that as well. Like we're kind of figuring out these conversations in real time in a lot of ways, and that makes it tricky, um, and a little bit messy sometimes. It's like, how do
Yeah.
we help tease these things apart?
Yeah, and I think it's the same with this term overtraining syndrome, which was certainly banded about more when I was looking into this red S, problem in 2014 than it perhaps is now, because we recognize through all this awesome research that that could actually be due to low energy availability or low carbohydrate availability specifically. So it's brilliant that we're slowly catching on to the fact this could be actually red S that's packaged up as overtraining syndrome. But either way, it helps to have some research to help others understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you mentioned the low carbohydrate availability piece, and I know that that was a part of the newer update that came out as well, and really just sort of breaking this topic open. And I think it's exciting on one hand that we have all of this awareness. We have a lot of research being turned to this topic. We have this really amazing push to how do we standardize even what is low energy availability? How do we measure that in certain people and populations? And it also kind of shines a spotlight on how prevalent this problem really is, especially in athletic folks. I know that you mentioned just a few minutes ago about, we used to think this is just an elite athlete problem. You might have maybe even considered yourself amongst, right, at a very prestigious running school, like a very, elite level collegiate athlete. When it comes to the more recreational crowd, you said that there's sometimes like this growing awareness and it sort of has pros and cons. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, because my population of people tend to not be the highest echelon of, either strength athletes or endurance athletes, but they are people who are out there, they're devoting a significant amount of time to their training. They really love it. Some compete, some don't. And so it can be hard, I think, for people to self-identify as this could be me. So do you have thoughts on, or what are your thoughts on the recreational crowd and how Red S is affecting that subset of the population?
Yeah, totally. I think that's something we should for sure focus some research on, because actually that's the population that I perhaps fear the most for, because they don't have access to sports psychologists, sports nutritionists necessarily through whatever institution or organization they're part of, because they're just doing this for the pure enjoyment of sport. And they're probably combining it with a busy day job, potentially parenthood, or any other sort of big life stress. You know, everybody has lots going on, and unless you're a professional athlete, you're not focusing solely on recovering in your downtime because you're filling it with work or social activities or any other kind of role. And I think that the energy balance at that point is even harder to maintain. So I think we should very much be focusing some awareness and prevention there, and not just talking about this as a competitive or elite level athlete problem.
Yeah, 100%. One of the things that comes up a lot when I talk to people about this is they say, but I'm not an athlete. Because in their mind, an athlete means there's some standard, there's some definition, there's some level of performance that they have to display, or they think Michael Phelps or Serena Williams, those are athletes, but I'm not an athlete. What are your thoughts on, who is an athlete, who qualifies for this in terms of something to keep on their radar?
Well, I love Stacey Sims, and I'm sure you'll have looked into her work, but her quote of "if you exercise on purpose, you are an athlete," I think just hits the mark, because you do not have to be competing. You don't even have to be doing anything structured. You just have to be moving your body, expending energy to therefore need to replenish that energy with your nutrition. And it is a shame that perhaps these conditions are marketed as athletic population problems, and perhaps that was due to its precursor being the female athlete triad. So we do have some work to do on awareness in that area, but that's part of what we aim to achieve. And it's hard because as an organization, you sort of have to hone in on a target audience if you want to reach people. But I would hate to alienate the other members of the population who can very much suffer from this condition too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a tough conversation to have and kind of get in there. What do you run into? And this is kind of a personal question, because this is something that I hear a lot, which is, well, we have so many people that are potentially consuming more calories than they need for their activity level. So how do we make sense of all of this when the world may have a subset of people who could potentially even be athletically active, they're recreationally active? How do we make sense of, are you consuming enough nutritional energy? Are you not? Because I hear this a lot, which is, not everybody, like they have so many people who are potentially overeating.
Mm.
How, but how do you address that question? What would you say?
Yeah, it's so difficult because we know from the research that your body shape or size does not determine whether you're eating enough. Because quite often, if you're not eating enough, your body will go into this self-preservation mode and either maintain or even increase your body weight, depending on what you're feeding it. So it's a very dangerous assumption to make that if someone is not underweight or what you would deem as a healthy BMI, that they are the only people suffering from low energy availability. But of course, yes, there are people who are overeating and not exercising enough, and we all just need to work harder to find the balance. But I think that the campaigning and the marketing towards the obesity crisis has just gone a bit too far in not recognizing the other scale of the problem and that side of the spectrum. So it is difficult. I think we just need to work on this balance word again. It all comes back to balance.
Yeah, for sure. Just even having the discussion about how it's nuanced and individual, right? Just because, somebody who may not have a good handle on their nutrition, for example. They maybe don't have the resources. And so they're not sure, maybe they are over consuming calories, but that doesn't mean that that's you. And
Mm.
everybody kind of has to assess that for themselves or get assistance in assessing that. And I think that that's, if we just try to put people into one bucket, we're like, well, everybody at this age is, when I say this age, I mean in their 40s and 50s, but everybody at this age, is struggling with, for example, eating too much, or maybe they're too sedentary. And that's just, we can't make that determination.
No, I watched a really interesting Ali Ostrander video. I'm not sure if you follow her. She's an elite runner in the States, and she was talking to her coach David Roche about, can you eat too much as a competitive endurance athlete? And I know not everyone listening will be competitive, but they might well be training as if they are. And they were basically deciding that if you're expending, a huge amount of energy through your training, you can't really overconsume certain food groups at least. And so you should just be more focused on eating enough than being afraid of this overconsumption. And I think David shared a quote that was like, eat too much sometimes, eat enough always, and eat too little never, which I just thought was fantastic for any active athlete to hear.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned the term athletic aesthetic, and I'm wondering if you can share with the listeners what you mean by that, and maybe potentially how it influenced either you or you see with the people that you come across through the Red S Project, how that athletic aesthetic has played a role in things like low energy availability and Red S.
Yeah, so I guess the term essentially describes what we all assume an athlete to look like externally. So I suppose when you are asked to imagine a endurance athlete, we all, I think, have a picture in our mind of someone who's lean and tall, and that's what we've been brought up viewing, at least, especially at the elite levels. And so a lot of comments and a lot of media focuses on that particular appearance, which we know through research and anecdotally that that's not what it requires to be successful or healthy necessarily. But it, some people are able to maintain low body mass and low fat mass and compete or perform in sport. But that's not the only way you need to look to feel good and perform well. So I think it's a shame that we haven't focused on a more diverse range of body types throughout history, especially when it comes to female athletes who are different to male athletes by nature. And I'm seeing more and more people talking about it, and fantastic people on Instagram, including you, talking about the fact that it's not always aesthetically advantageous to pursue this low body mass. So it's a conversation that needs to be raised and continually talked about, I think.
Mm-hmm. When you were competing in Florida, did you ever was there ever conversation from coaching staff or other athletes, other runners on your team, even, where there was a drive to get you all to be smaller or leaner or lighter, or to just be smaller for the sake of better performance?
Yeah, for sure. There always was this focus on, I guess, lighter is faster. It wasn't potentially explicitly spelt out, but we all knew that that was the goal. And with this focus on clean eating and the fact that the coach pretty much always bought size small for the team, at least the A team, is quite implied. And it's such a shame because, that does plant a seed, especially for influential young athletes who are still going through puberty and learning how to work with their body. And it's such a shame because I look back and I think, if only I had maintained this outlook I had when I was 16, when I ate what I wanted and ran loads and I never really gave it much thought. If only I maintained that kind of focus on things, I probably would have avoided this really debilitating condition. And who knows where I would have ended up performance-wise.
Mm. Were there any adjustments that you made to your training to try to, when you were saying, your performances started to suffer, how, if at all, did you try to shift your training to compensate for that?
Yeah, well, sadly, because I didn't know enough and I wasn't perhaps in the best place to hear advice had it been given to me about resting more, I actually did the opposite. So I thought, okay, well, I must just be unfit. There's no reason why I'm starting to perform poorly or, experiencing a plateau in my performance. So I must just need to train harder. And because on the outside, I looked to be what I thought was an elite athlete's physique. I didn't identify that I had lost weight, which doesn't happen for everybody in an energy deficit. And no one mentioned it. Everyone said I looked great and I was in shape. And I never had anybody say, look, you're looking unhealthy, you're performing poorly, you've got low energy, which is crazy because looking back, it was so obvious, but no one could help me put those pieces of the puzzle together. So I ended up just training more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I hear that a lot as well from the populations I tend to work with, which is, if you're not performing well, then it just must be that you're not training enough. It's like the
Mm.
first thing that we go to, instead of looking broader and more holistically at what the person is actually doing, what their inputs are, and that sort of thing. So hopefully through a lot of the work that you all are doing, we'll start to eventually change that perception. And it's kind of that natural thing, which is, I'm just not doing enough. Myself being in the cycling world, the mountain biking world, we're mountain bikers at that time. We were a little bit different from road racers and whatnot, but the ideal was still, thin, small, very slight of build, just be as little as possible. And that led me down a lot of the decisions and the habits and routines that I was doing as well, which was just, I just need to eat less. I just need to be smaller and ride more. I need to
Yeah.
train more. And so, like you were
Mm.
saying earlier, it's kind of that perfect storm of underfueling, overtraining. And, there were definitely a couple of big periods in my life where that had some pretty significant impacts. I did have a huge period of burnout after many years of racing mountain bikes, triathlons, and was just done. And then kind of got into weight training, but there was still that food piece of the puzzle for me that wasn't adequate enough. And so I think, again, this was probably about 2012 at the time where I really was seeking out help and guidance on this. And it was just kind of mind blowing to me, not much like you were saying with your own story, that the answer wasn't just lying in the training, that, oh, wow, okay, we actually have to think about eating appropriately for the amount of activity that we're doing, and we'll be better off for it.
Yeah. And I guess one of the challenges we face is that in society in general, we are praised typically for the behaviors and actions that lead to low energy availability. So, eating loads of vegetables and cutting back on carbs and, avoiding fats and all of these things that, we've been sold by diet culture that are so inappropriate for any exercising person. And I guess the other challenge we're facing is that, at least initially, somebody who is focusing more on their training and their diet might experience some performance enhancement effect. You might start to feel fitter and healthier and better in your skin. And then, you kind of drop off this U-shaped curve into the abyss of low energy availability. And because no one was talking about it when we were experiencing it, you don't know that. And as you say, you just keep going because there's no information out there to tell you otherwise.
Absolutely. I know one of the fears that a lot of people have when they start restoring their energy intake to appropriate levels is that, if they're, for example, in a sport where there are weight classes, that their weight class could change. that their body is going to change. And obviously there are a lot of supports for dealing with this. And I think, we've talked a lot about on this podcast over the years, mental health support and making sure that if body image is really, if there's like a severe issue or just something you want to talk through with somebody, like it's okay to get help for that. But I'm wondering from your perspective, do you all run into that fear from folks, which is, okay, well, I know that I might perform better, but I'm afraid of what's going to happen to my body, and sort of what supports or advice do you have for people there?
Definitely. I think there's a small percentage of the population who are solely performance focused, and that's perhaps your elite competitive athlete who are less reluctant to make changes because they know in the long run it's going to benefit their performance, and therefore they're able to suck up the potential changes to their body that might not be desirable to them in the short term. But for the most part, people are so afraid of altering their body composition. We've all been led to believe that thinner is better, thinner is faster. And even when that isn't working anymore, people aren't getting thinner, or they're maybe even gaining weight. We're still so afraid of behavior change because we've maintained these behaviors for so long and they've become habitual, and it's scary to step out of your comfort zone sometimes. So I personally think this is where the benefits of mentoring comes in, because when you're speaking to somebody who has been there and experienced what you're experiencing, and then been able with support to make those changes, it's much easier to take on what they're saying and to relate to them and to ask them the right questions and get the right support, I think. So that's what we focus on, as well as, of course, medical, dietary, and psychological support from specialists. But yeah, it's incredibly common that you might have the diagnosis, you might know exactly what's wrong and what you need to do, but that's a very different ball game to actually doing it.
Yes, for sure. Just a couple more questions so we can talk more about the Red S Project. You mentioned some of the things that you all are doing and providing, but I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to specifically what is the mission? How do you work to accomplish that mission through the day-to-day and the things that you're up to as an organization?
Yes, so it's a very simple mission of awareness, prevention, and support. So we want to make sure that everyone who is active knows of this term Red S or REDS, and knows, what the symptoms are, how to avoid it, which feeds into the prevention arm of how can we get this education embedded within coaching practices, or in the mass audience, so that people who are just recreational and following certain Instagram accounts know how to avoid low energy availability, which is where your work is so fantastic. And then support is signposting people towards tried and trusted dietitians or medical specialists or psychological experts who are in the know about Red S and who can support someone who's suffering from it without simply dismissing the fact that they're missing their menstrual cycle, or that they have a low libido, or that their performance is suffering for seemingly no reason. So we, as a team, try very hard to work on all of those three things. But ideally, we would be putting more time and energy into the prevention side of things, so that we don't have to help dig people out of the hole that they find themselves in.
Yeah, 100%. I love that you brought up coaches and coaching. I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you all advocate that coaches can help their athletes, whether this is sort of a competitive level thing or a more recreational coaching type of situation? What do you think makes a big difference in Red S and getting that information out to athletes from the coaching side?
Well, so I believe that it's the coach's responsibility to have a strong understanding of Red S and what it might present itself as in an athlete. And that's not necessarily just appearance. It's, you know, the things the athlete might be saying, or how their training is going, or, you know, their mental well-being. And then knowing where to signpost the athlete without trying to solve all the problems themselves. You know, it's not a coach's responsibility to be providing nutritional advice necessarily, or to be a psychologist. So I think every coach needs to be aware of what the problem is, know how to refer an athlete to support services, and also just be importantly strong role model themselves to, you know, say the right things, to avoid saying the wrong things, to practice this balance to help athletes engage in flexibility and not so much rigidity and obsessive behaviors. So there's lots of things a coach can do, but first and foremost, just an understanding of what this is and why it really matters.
Yeah, I would say all of that is so important. And to your point, even the idea, the term of Red S is still fairly new. And I mean, if we're talking about basically a decade here at this point, I still run across lots of coaches, whether they coach strength training, they work with athletes on more endurance type sports. They're working with people on their nutrition, and those people tend to be recreationally active, right? That's kind of part of the idea of nutrition coaching, is a lot of times also facilitating people's lifestyle choices and getting them more physically active. And so I think it should be part of all of the different types of certifying curricula here in the States, at least for things like personal training and even different organizations. I used to be in USA weightlifting coach, so certified under them. And I can't remember ever even running across any of that information in the training manuals. So it's still such a big missing piece. And I'm so glad that you all are doing this work, and it's getting more international attention as well, because here in the States, it's just, I feel like we have a really long way to go.
Yeah. And I suppose, you know, it has been 10 years since this term came out, but even before that, this was always a problem. And it was just that we weren't directing enough energy and focus to the fact that this has a huge impact on any active person's life. And we need to just stop thinking so much about performance, and especially short-term performance, because it really is impactful on not just your physical health, but your mental health too. And it takes a long time to get over something like this, which is why prevention is so key. But yeah, I think you're doing fantastic work, and we all are. But I think I guess we could look to the concussion crisis as an example of how change can be facilitated. And I'm not going to give up hope that we're not all going to be talking about this problem in years to come, because it is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I love bringing folks like yourself, Kaniska Advocacy, et cetera, on the show, because even though you're talking about similar things, it's just one more touch point to get this information out to people, to have that conversation. I know I get occasionally emails and messages from parents who are also, thinking about this and concerned about their kids who are in sports and maybe even performing at a fairly high level. So the more we can put it out there, I think the better. And it's gonna happen what's going to happen, one person at a time. And as long as we're doing that and we're reaching that one person who needs to hear this podcast or see that post on Instagram that's that counter to something kind of icky that they're seeing in their feed, that's all we can do, right, is put it out there and give people the good quality information that they really need.
For sure. Yeah. And I think it does fall down to a lot of high performing athletes as well, to be positive role models and to be opening up the conversation, because they do hold a lot of influence and they do have a huge following. And it's been amazing to watch people talk about the term Red S without having to really introduce it as a concept. You know, they might just post it in an Instagram caption and assume that their audience know what they're talking about, which is really heartening for me, particularly because 10 years ago, no one would have had a clue what that stood for.
Absolutely. What's on the horizon for the Red S Project? Any new initiatives, or are you sort of on autopilot trying to maintain what you've put into place so far? What is the organization up to?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're always trying to move forward. It's hard because we don't have as much funding as would be ideal to get this really off the ground on a huge scale. But we're constantly working on those three pillars. And one thing that I would love to see happening more is I guess a kind of army of mentors who are available and based in different time zones and different locations, to speak to people who are suffering, to help with the support side of things. And then I would love to see the NCAA, in particular, stepping up with some prevention practices. And I have been helping to develop this awareness toolkit for coaches, and I'm really hoping that we can get that rolled out in the NCAA. But if anyone listening has any contacts that could be useful, or if you know of anyone who knows of anyone, it's incredibly hard to get a foot in the door there, especially when you're based in England. So yeah, we need all the help we can get, I guess.
All right. International audience is definitely what this podcast has. Somebody will know somebody, I'm sure. So this is how the magic happens. And this is why podcasting is so powerful. So I'm going to put it out there too. I mean, we'll even try to tag them up in the, in the, in the caption of this when it goes out on social media. But yeah, absolutely. Keep up the great work that you're doing. I'm so glad that you've decided to take up this torch. And any coaches out there, I always say, if anybody wants to talk to me about it, look at the other podcasts that we've had on this topic, dive into your website. It's great as well. Kniska Advocacy is another great one. Just get informed and have these conversations with the people around you too. That's, I think, how this is going to spread and awareness will continue to grow. So well done. And I really appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for all the awesome work you do. I think it's so important that you have such a huge following and you're spreading all the right messages and helping to counteract the potentially less helpful messages we find online. So thank you. And it's a pleasure to be part of your parade.
Thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
All right, speak soon.